They say the worst cruelty of slavery was the whip, the chains, the hunger. They were wrong. The real horror was the things slaves were forced to hide, abilities, instincts, and secrets that could get them killed if anyone ever discovered them. Imagine living every minute of your life pretending to be weaker, quieter, smaller than you are. Imagine knowing something that could protect you, even save you. But the moment you use it, the moment someone suspects you're different, this story begins with that pressure. The pressure of a woman who carried a secret no slave was ever allowed to possess. Because in 1857, a slave woman whispered one forbidden sentence into the ear of a violent mastiff, and the dog stopped breathing. Not dead, not alive, just listening. People claimed she had tricked the beast. Others said she bewitched it, but the truth was darker. The animal recognized her. But how? From where? And why did the master panic when he realized it? And now, this is the moment the truth begins. The moment her secret stopped being silent and started changing the Hale plantation forever. They will tell you this story began with a purchase, a simple exchange of money, a man a slave, a duty. But that is a lie, because the truth you were never supposed to hear, begins with what the woman whispered to the dog before midnight, when the house slept and every human eye was blind. A whisper that made the animal freeze, tilt its head, and listen like a child being spoken to by a mother it never had. And if you think that's impossible, then you have no idea what the enslaved learned to hide. Listen carefully. In the America of 1857, cruelty was not only a system, it was a science. Masters studied the bodies of slaves like instruments. But there was one thing they never understood. The human mind learns how to survive in ways the oppressor never predicts. And his story is proof. The master, Jonathan Hale, believed he was making a practical, unremarkable decision. His prized hunting dog, a massive black mastiff named Brutus, grew restless after the death of Hale's wife. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't obey, wouldn't even sleep. Hale blamed the servants, the weather, the food, everything except his own cruelty. So he went to the auction block and bought a woman. She was small, quiet, and expressionless. Her name was Mariana, though the trader called her Mira because he had neither the patience nor the decency to pronounce her real name. The papers said she was purchased to care for the animal. Just that, a line of ink, a human being assigned to a dog. But the moment she stepped onto the Hale plantation, things shifted in ways no one could explain. Brutus, the beast who mauled 3 men, lowered his head when she approached him, as if recognizing her, as if remembering something older than the plantation, older than the land, older than the chains. The overseer called it trickery. The cook called it witchcraft. The master called it useful. But the truth? That night, behind the closed door of the dog's quarters, Mira did something no slave was ever permitted to do. She spoke, not to the master, not to God, but to the animal in a language no one living on that plantation had ever heard. And by dawn, the dog was changed, not calm, not obedient, awakened. The first dawn after Myra's arrival was a silence no one on the Hale plantation could explain. Brutus, the vicious mastiff whose growl once sent grown men fleeing, lay quietly at the back of the kennels. His eyes, once fiery and wild, now reflected something older, something ancient and knowing. It was not obedience. No master's leash could claim that. It was awareness. Jonathan Hale, proud and cruel, didn't know what to make of it. He watched with suspicion as Mira moved silently through the house, her gaze sharp and unreadable, her every motion a quiet command. The plantation was a cage, not just for the slaves, but for the secrets buried beneath its surface. What nobody realized was this: Mira was not a simple woman sold as property. She carried a heritage older than America itself, a forbidden legacy of power buried beneath the chains of slavery. The other slaves whispered of her in hushed tones. They called her the Shadow, a ghost with eyes that saw through walls and hands that could calm the raging storm. But Jonathan dismissed it all. Superstition, tales told to soothe frightened minds. He was a man who trusted only what he could control. Until the night he found Mira alone with Brutus in the kennel. No fidelite, no witnesses, just the dark and the heavy breath of a beast. He heard her voice, low, almost a chant, words he couldn't understand. Yet the dog's growl faded to a deep, steady rhythm. Jonathan's hand tightened on the railing as he listened, heart pounding with a fear he refused to name. Because he knew what slaves were supposed to be: silent, broken, invisible. And Mira was none of those things. She was something else entirely. What happened in that kennel that night was a fracture in the reality Hale believed in. The lines between master and servant blurred, between man and beast, between the known and the forbidden. And it was only the beginning, because what Mira did next would challenge every law, every rule, every truth the plantation and the world were built on. Remember this name, Mariana, because she was about to teach Jonathan Hale and everyone who lived on that cursed land what real power looked like. The days after that night felt like a slow unraveling of everything Jonathan Hale thought he knew. Mira moved through the plantation like a shadow made flesh, quiet, observant, untouchable. The staff whispered, the slaves watched, and the master grew restless. He tried to assert control, ordered her to stick to simple tasks: feed the dog, clean the kennels, keep out of sight. But Myra's presence was magnetic, impossible to ignore. Her eyes held storms, and when she looked at Jonathan, it was as if she peered straight into his soul, exposing the fears he buried deep beneath his cold exterior. One evening, after supper, Jonathan found himself drawn to the dog's quarters again. Brutus lay calm, almost regal. Mira sat beside him, softly humming a tune that seemed ancient, something neither Jonathan nor the other servants could place. "Why do you sing to a beast?" Jonathan asked, voice rough. Myra's eyes met his, unflinching. "Because sometimes man forgets the language of the wild," she said softly. Brutus remembers. Jonathan's laugh was bitter. Animals obey orders. They do not remember. But the truth was gnawing at him. Brutus obeyed no one, and yet he obeyed Mira. More than that, the dog's restlessness had vanished, replaced by a calm alertness that unsettled Jonathan. Whispers spread among the slaves, rumors of secret meetings at night, of Mira teaching not only the dog but the children of the household. Some claimed she spoke of things forbidden, knowledge outlawed by the masters. Jonathan confronted her once, furious. "Do you know what will happen if I catch you teaching those children things they shouldn't learn?" Myra's response was chilling in its calmness. "If the truth is forbidden, then it is the chains that bind you, not the knowledge." The plantation's rigid hierarchy trembled as the invisible war between power and silence grew fiercer. Jonathan found himself haunted by dreams, visions of a past he did not live, voices calling from the darkness, a history erased by fire and fear. He questioned everything, his legacy, his beliefs, the very laws that ruled his world. But the more he questioned, the deeper the darkness around him grew. Because Mira was not just a caretaker for a dog. She was a teacher, a keeper of forbidden knowledge, and the master's world was about to shatter. Night after night, the plantation held its breath. Myra's influence spread like wildfire in shadows, quiet, unseen, but impossible to deny. Jonathan could no longer dismiss the subtle shifts. The way his daughter's laughter softened, how the household staff's wary glances turned to suspicion, and most terrifyingly, the change in Brutus, no longer a savage beast, but something different. It wasn't just the dog who was awakened. The children, the slaves, even Jonathan himself found themselves caught in a silent storm, pulled between fear and fascination. One evening, as the moon cast long silver shadows, Jonathan's daughter, little Evelyn, slipped quietly from her room. He followed her in disbelief, heart pounding with dread. There she was, sitting beside Mira in the garden, under the ancient oak tree, listening to her speak in hushed tones. Myra's voice was calm, but filled with power, weaving stories not of fairy tales or lullabies, but of truths buried by time and blood. "Do you know why you cry, Evelyn?" Mira asked softly. The child's eyes widened, trembling. "Because you miss your mother," Mira continued, "and because they told you to forget her too fast." Jonathan's blood ran cold. This was no longer about a dog, or even a slave woman's secret. This was about breaking chains. The law forbade slaves from teaching children, from sharing knowledge. It was a crime punishable by death. And yet, here it was, unfolding in the moonlight, unstoppable. Jonathan wanted to tear it apart, to reassert his power with fear and violence. But something in Myra's calm strength held him back. She wasn't just a servant, she was a reckoning. And every secret she whispered was a crack in the foundation of his world. That night, the plantation was no longer a place of simple ownership. It became a battleground between old laws and new truths, between fear and awakening, between chains and freedom. Jonathan knew one thing clearly. If Myra's secret ever came to light, it wouldn't just ruin him. It would shake the entire society built on slavery to its core. And yet, he was powerless to stop it. The plantation was no longer just a home or a prison. It was a crucible, a place where old worlds met new, and where secrets refused to stay buried. Jonathan Hale felt it like a weight pressing down on his chest. The whispers among the slaves grew louder. Rumors that Myra's power was not natural, that she spoke the language of spirits, that she was protected by forces no man dared name. And it was true, though no one could have guessed how deep that truth ran. Mira carried a bloodline older than any plantation owner's pedigree. A line of healers, seers, and guardians. Women who had passed their knowledge in secret through generations. Knowledge so dangerous that it was outlawed and hunted mercilessly. That knowledge wasn't just medicine or folk magic. It was something else. The power to influence minds, to calm wild beasts, to touch the unseen threads that bind the world together. Jonathan had seen it firsthand. Brutus obeyed Myra's every command not because of fear, but because he trusted her. A trust no whip could force. And the children, they listened and learned. Their innocent minds blossomed with truths that no school or church dared teach. Jonathan's world was cracking, and with it, the fragile facade of Southern society. But the master's fear was only the surface of a greater danger. Because far beyond the plantation, in the halls of power and shadow, men whispered of the Shadow's curse, a name that sent chills through governors, slave traders, and ministers alike. They spoke of a woman who could undo the order of the world, who could awaken slaves not just to rebellion, but to something darker, something that could topple kings and shatter empires. And Jonathan realized with growing horror, Mira was no ordinary slave woman. She was a symbol of a truth that frightened every man who clung to power. The more he tried to control her, the more she slipped through his fingers like smoke. And in that slipping was the seed of something unstoppable. Because some truths can't be caged, some powers can't be chained, and some women can change the course of history with a single whispered word. Jonathan's nightmare was only beginning. The air in the Hale mansion grew heavier with every passing night. Jonathan could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him, judging, waiting. Mira was no longer simply a caretaker. She had become the fulcrum on which the balance of power teetered. The slave quarters whispered with her name, the Shadow. But it was more than a nickname. It was a prophecy. Jonathan began to understand the terrifying scope of what he had brought into his home. One evening, Mira confronted him, not with fear, but with clarity. She said, "You bought me to care for a dog, but I carry a legacy you cannot buy or sell." Her voice was calm, but the meaning struck like a hammer. "Legacy?" he asked bitterly. "Power, knowledge, freedom." Jonathan scoffed, but inside, doubt gnawed at him. That night, as the household slept, he found himself drawn once again to the kennel. There, Mira chanted in a language long lost to time, her voice weaving spells not meant for the ears of men who ruled with iron fists. Brutus, the fierce mastiff, lay still as stone, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Jonathan's fear was primal, ancient, because what Mira summoned was not just obedience. It was awakening. She wasn't teaching children mere lessons. She was awakening souls trapped beneath centuries of chains and lies. The old world, the one that believed it could bind men, women, and beasts alike, was crumbling. Jonathan realized that no whip, no law, no tradition could hold back what Mira represented. She was the beginning of a reckoning. And with every secret she revealed, the plantation, the very foundation of his world, edged closer to collapse. The walls of the Hale estate no longer felt like protection. They were a prison tightening around Jonathan's sanity. His nights were restless, haunted by visions of an unraveling world, where the chains he clung to shattered under invisible hands. Mira's influence seeped into every corner of the plantation, an invisible tide eroding centuries of control. Jonathan's daughter, Evelyn, once silent and fearful, now spoke words that weren't meant for a child of her age. Words of freedom, of unseen worlds, whispered in the dead of night by Mira's patient teachings. But such knowledge was poison to those who thrived on fear and submission. The overseers grew uneasy, whispering warnings. The housekeeper, Mrs. Thornton, scowled with suspicion, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Rumors began to swirl in Charleston's elite circles. Strange behaviors on the Hale plantation, a curse spreading through the household. Jonathan faced a brutal truth. The power Mira wielded threatened not only his control, but the fragile order of an entire society built on oppression. And yet, amidst the fear and chaos, He found himself drawn to her, not by desire, but by a terrible respect for the force she represented. She was a mirror reflecting everything he tried to deny: weakness, fear, and a deep, aching hunger for something beyond power. One night, Jonathan confronted Mira in the garden beneath the ancient oak tree. "Why do you defy the laws that keep this world in balance?" he demanded. Myra's gaze was steady, unwavering. "Because the laws are chains forged by men afraid of losing their thrones," she replied softly. "Your world is built on silence and fear. But silence breeds rebellion. Fear breeds courage." The words cut deeper than any lash. Jonathan knew then that the war wasn't just for control of a plantation. It was for the soul of a nation. And Mira was the spark. The plantation was a crucible where old fears clashed with the fire of change. Jonathan Hale, once confident in his authority, now wrestled with a terrifying truth. The foundation of his power was crumbling beneath him. Myra's presence was no longer just a secret whispered in the dark. It was a challenge, a reckoning. The dog, Brutus, became a symbol, fierce yet obedient only to her will, a silent testament to the shifting tides. The slaves watched in silence, eyes gleaming with a newfound hope that frightened their masters. Jonathan could see it in their faces, the hunger for freedom, the spark ignited by Myra's forbidden lessons. But the outside world would not tolerate such rebellion. Charleston's elite whispered in shadowed rooms, plotting to snuff out the spark before it became a blaze. The law was clear. Slaves caught teaching forbidden knowledge faced brutal punishment. Jonathan knew this well. His own household staff had been warned. Yet every night, Mira defied those laws, weaving her dark knowledge into the minds of the young and the oppressed. He stood at the edge of a precipice, watching a world he knew slip away. And the truth gnawed at him. Was he the master or the prisoner? The man who bought a slave to care for a dog had instead unleashed a force that no whip could control. And now there was no turning back. Because some secrets demand to be heard. Some chains are meant to be broken. And some nights change everything. Darkness had settled over the Hale plantation, but it was not the quiet kind. It was a restless, charged darkness, thick with secrets and suppressed truths. Jonathan walked the halls at night, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. Mira moved through the shadows like a ghost, present yet elusive. He couldn't shake the feeling that she knew more about him than he did himself. One evening, as the wind howled through the ancient oaks, Jonathan confronted her again. "Why do you defy the world that keeps you bound?" Myra's reply was calm, like a tide washing over stone. "Because the world you protect is built on lies and silence." Her words echoed in his mind long after she left the room. Jonathan realized that Mira was not just a slave woman. She was a force of nature, a living rebellion wrapped in flesh and whispered knowledge. She taught not just the children, but awakened something long buried in the hearts of the enslaved. Hope. Fear of that hope drove Jonathan to desperation. He began to watch her more closely, try to find the cracks in her armor. But there were none, only the fierce determination of a woman who carried the weight of generations. Jonathan's power felt fragile, a brittle shell ready to shatter. And with every lesson Mira gave, every secret she shared, the fragile world he clung to slipped further into chaos. The master who thought he bought a slave to care for a dog was instead caught in a war for his own soul. Because the night held secrets darker than any shadow, and those secrets were waking. Jonathan's world was unraveling, thread by fragile thread. Every day, the plantation hummed with a quiet rebellion, the kind that whispered in glances, hid in half-spoken words, and breathed beneath the surface of obedience. He realized then the true power Mira wielded was psychological, a mastery of minds far beyond physical chains. She bent wills without force, reshaping fears into courage, doubt into resolve. The law could not touch what lived in the mind. Jonathan's authority, once absolute, was now threatened by a power he could neither see nor fight with muscle and whip. The overseer's threats became hollow. The servant's respect for Mira bordered on reverence. And Jonathan's daughter, once broken and silent, laughed with a brightness that unsettled the rigid order of the house. It was a rebellion fought not with guns, but with knowledge, the kind that seeds revolution. But this war was dangerous, not just to Jonathan, but to the entire social order that held the South in a grip of fear. If word of Myra's teachings escaped the plantation walls, the consequences would be catastrophic. Jonathan faced a grim choice: crush this awakening and risk destroying his own family's legacy, or surrender to a force far greater than himself. He could feel the noose tightening, society's laws, whispers of scandal, the threat of violence. Yet beneath it all, a darker truth pulsed. Mira was not just changing minds. She was awakening something primal, a force that could tear down kings and shatter empires. Jonathan, trapped in his own fear, realized the fight was no longer for control, but for survival. And in the shadows, those waiting to see the fall of the old world began to move. The plantation's atmosphere shifted, silent yet electric. Jonathan sensed the invisible threads pulling tighter around him. Myra's influence was no longer just a secret. It was a storm gathering strength. She moved like a shadow, unseen but unstoppable, weaving her lessons into the hearts of the enslaved and the young alike. The children's laughter grew louder, but so did the whispers of rebellion among the adults. Jonathan watched helplessly as his grip on power loosened with every lesson Mira imparted. His fears were confirmed when the overseers reported strange behavior. Defiance masked as obedience, glances exchanged like coded messages. But it was more than just rebellion, it was awakening. Mira taught the forbidden truths, stories of ancestors, forgotten histories, the power locked inside every soul shackled by chains. And the slaveholder's world trembled. Jonathan's own mind became a battlefield. He wrestled with rage, fear, and a grudging respect for Myra's strength. His daughter, Evelyn, blossomed under Myra's care, her eyes shining with knowledge that unsettled the household's rigid norms. Yet Jonathan was torn. To destroy Mira would be to shatter the fragile peace and risk a violent uprising. To allow her freedom meant relinquishing the control he had always wielded. Caught in the eye of this storm, Jonathan realized something terrifying. The laws and lashings were powerless against the power Mira wielded. Because true control was never about chains, it was about the mind. And Mira was the master of minds. The plantation was no longer just land and buildings. It had become a battleground of wills, a crucible where old power struggled desperately against new. Jonathan felt his authority erode day by day, like sand slipping through clenched fists. Mira was no longer just a caretaker or a teacher. She was a revolution wrapped in a quiet voice. She wielded forbidden knowledge like a weapon, planting seeds of defiance in the minds of the enslaved and even the master's own daughter. Her lessons were more than words. They were a call to awaken the spirit bound beneath centuries of chains. Jonathan tried to grasp control, to reassert dominance with threats and discipline, but his efforts were met with silence, or worse, subtle resistance that gnawed at his confidence. The household staff watched with wary eyes, caught between fear of punishment and hope for change. Rumors spread through Charleston's elite, dark whispers of a curse or dark magic infecting the Hale estate. Jonathan's once unshakable world was cracking, fractured by truths too dangerous to speak aloud. And in the quiet moments, when the moon hung low and shadows danced, he realized the terrifying possibility. Mira was not just defying the laws of man. She was breaking the chains of time itself. The old order, built on fear and silence, was crumbling. And Jonathan, the man who bought a slave to care for a dog, was trapped at the center of a storm he could neither control nor escape. The night held its breath over the Hale plantation, as if the very air waited for the next move in this unfolding battle of wills. Jonathan stood at the edge of the garden, watching the flicker of candlelight in Myra's quarters, knowing that every secret she whispered could ignite a revolution. His daughter Evelyn was no longer the frightened child she once was. Under Myra's quiet guidance, she had begun to speak words that carried power, words that questioned, that challenged, that dreamed of freedom. But this awakening came with a price. Jonathan's mind was a battlefield of fear and fascination. He realized the power Mira wielded was not merely in her knowledge, but in the way she transformed those around her, reshaping fear into courage, submission into rebellion. This was not just a story of a master and a slave. It was a story of broken chains and forbidden truths, of hidden agendas written in the blood-soaked soil of the South. Now, here's where I want you to pause, reflect, and engage. Tell me in the comments. The shadow reveals the light. And then say it again. The shadow reveals the light. Repeat these words, because these words hold a key, a symbol of transformation, a moment where the hidden becomes clear and the powerless awaken to their own strength. This phrase is not just a sentence. It's an invocation, a sign that you are ready to see beyond the veil, to walk deeper into forbidden knowledge, and to break free from the chains that bind you. Remember this moment, because from here, the descent only grows darker, and the truths you uncover will change everything you thought you knew about power, control, and freedom. You repeated the phrase, and now the door has cracked open. The veil is thinning. What you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. Myra's teachings were more than lessons in reading or counting. They were a subversion of the system itself. She revealed to Evelyn the stories of those erased from history, ancestors stripped of identity, voices silenced by fear and violence. In secret, beneath the moon's cold gaze, the girl learned not just words but power, knowledge that threatened to dismantle the very foundations of their world. Jonathan's unease deepened. The child he thought was fragile was becoming a beacon, a spark in the darkness too long unquestioned. Every night, the household grew more restless. Silent glances between servants spoke of hope and terror. Jonathan understood this was no longer about obedience. It was about the revolution of the mind and soul. Mira was the architect of that revolution, and he was caught in the middle, a man fighting to maintain an empire built on lies and chains. Yet, despite his fear, a dark curiosity gnawed at him. What would happen if these chains broke? Would chaos reign? Or would something new emerge? The answer was unknown, but one thing was certain. The power to change everything had been awakened. The master who bought a slave to care for a dog had unleashed a force that could shatter empires. And the world would never be the same again. The plantation held its breath, balanced on a knife's edge between order and chaos. Jonathan felt the walls closing in, suffocating him with the weight of his own fears. Myra's quiet defiance had become a storm that threatened to tear apart everything he knew. She moved through the household like a shadow of change, unseen by some, but felt by all. Evelyn, once a fragile child, now carried herself with a newfound strength. Her laughter echoed like a rebellion. Her questions cut like knives through the thick silence of tradition. Jonathan's nights were haunted by visions of a world unbound by chains and laws. A world where power was no longer held by those who wielded whips, but by those who controlled knowledge. And knowledge was the deadliest weapon of all. He realized that Myra's lessons were not just about survival. They were about liberation. But liberation came at a cost. The plantation's delicate balance was breaking, and with it, the illusion of control. The whispers grew louder inside the house, in the fields, even in the city. Charleston's elite feared the contagion of freedom. Jonathan faced a terrifying question. Could he stop what had already begun? Or was he doomed to watch his world burn? Because once the mind awakens, no chains can hold it. And once the truth breaks free, it consumes everything in its path. The nights grew colder, but the fire within the Hale household blazed hotter than ever. Jonathan found himself haunted not just by the threat to his estate, but by the woman who had become the center of his unraveling world. Mira was no longer just a slave or caretaker. She was a symbol of resistance, a beacon of forbidden knowledge wrapped in flesh and bone. His daughter, Evelyn's laughter, was different now, filled with a strange, knowing light that unsettled even the hardened staff. Jonathan's attempts to reassert his dominance faltered, swallowed by the growing power of the invisible rebellion. He caught himself wondering if he was fighting a losing battle against a force greater than his fear. The plantation was no longer a place of silence and submission. It was alive with whispers, with stories, with a spirit that refused to be broken. And the truth was terrifying, because Jonathan realized that what Mira had awakened was not just hope. It was the inevitability of change. The old world, built on bones and blood, was crumbling beneath the weight of hidden truths, and he was powerless to stop it. Jonathan's mind was a battleground, torn between fear and fascination. He saw clearly now. Mira was not merely a woman. She was a force, a living embodiment of the truths the powerful sought to bury. Her lessons weren't just knowledge. They were weapons forged in the fires of centuries of oppression. She taught Evelyn not just to read words, but to decode the lies that had kept their world shackled. The plantation's hierarchy trembled under the weight of this silent uprising. The overseers, once confident in their iron grip, faltered before a revolution no whip could quell. Jonathan felt the walls of his world collapsing. The legacy he'd fought to protect was dissolving in the glow of a candlelit room where forbidden books were passed hand to hand. And with every page turned, the chains loosened. He understood then the terrifying truth power had shifted, not to those born into privilege, but to those awakened to truth. Jonathan faced a choice: fight to preserve a dying order, or embrace a future forged in the fire of transformation. But the clock was ticking, and the consequences of his decision would echo far beyond the plantation walls. The plantation was a powder keg, waiting for a single spark to ignite a blaze that could not be contained. Jonathan's sleepless nights were filled with dread, the heavy knowledge that his world was slipping through his fingers. Myra's quiet power had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. Her lessons seeped into every corner of the household, lighting fires in hearts long dimmed by despair. Evelyn's transformation was undeniable, her innocence replaced by a fierce intelligence that unsettled even the oldest servants. But the danger wasn't just to Jonathan or his family. It was to the entire social order that depended on silence, fear, and control. Word had begun to spread beyond the plantation. Whispered rumors of forbidden teachings, secret meetings, and a spark of rebellion that threatened to consume the South. Jonathan realized that this was no longer a personal battle. It was a war against a system designed to crush hope. And in that war, there were no innocents. Every choice carried a price. Every silence was a weapon. And every truth revealed was a step closer to either liberation or destruction. The storm that had gathered around the Hale plantation finally found its form. It arrived not with thunder, but with riders. 3 men from Charleston, dressed in black coats and carrying questions sharpened like blades, arrived at Jonathan's door. They were not here for tea. They were not here for civility. They were here for control. Rumors had reached the city. Whispers of a slave woman teaching forbidden knowledge, of a child speaking truths she shouldn't know, of a plantation infected with rebellion. Jonathan's blood ran cold as the men stepped inside. Their eyes scanned the house like predators searching for prey. Mira felt the shift even before the men uttered a word. She moved through the shadows silently, her senses sharpened, her spirit braced. She had always known this day might come. Revolutions are never allowed to remain hidden for long. Jonathan tried to maintain composure, but his voice betrayed him. When one of the men asked, "Where is the woman they call Mira?" he felt something break inside him. This was no simple inquiry. This was a warning, a threat, a promise of violence disguised as law. The men prowled the halls, demanding answers, scanning every corner for signs of forbidden teachings. Evelyn clung to her father's side, her eyes bright with fear and something else, resolve. She whispered, "Papa, don't let them take her." But Jonathan had no power here. Not anymore. He realized with a sickening jolt that the world he had once controlled now controlled him. Upstairs, Mira prepared for whatever came next. She wasn't afraid of punishment. She was afraid of losing the future she had begun to build, the fragile awakening that had spread like light through darkness. Downstairs, the men tightened their circle. The storm had arrived, and there was no stopping what came next. The men in black did not wait for permission. They spread through the house with the arrogance of those who believed they were the law, because in this world, they were. Boots on the wooden floor, sharp voices cutting through the halls, questions fired like bullets. Jonathan followed helplessly, his authority shredded, his fear laid bare. Evelyn clutched his sleeve, whispering, "Papa, please, don't let them hurt her." But the truth was brutal. Jonathan no longer had the power to protect anyone. Not Mira, not his daughter, not even himself. Upstairs, Mira stepped out of the shadows. Her calm was unsettling, almost supernatural. She did not tremble. She did not plead. She simply existed with a strength that made the walls seem weak. When the men found her standing at the end of the hallway, they paused, just for a heartbeat. Even they felt it. The force, the presence, the quiet defiance that radiated from her was like heat from a fire. One of the men stepped forward, his voice cold. "You've been teaching them." Mira didn't deny it. She didn't bow. She didn't break. "I've taught them truth," she said softly. And truth is not a crime. But in their world, truth was the greatest crime. Jonathan watched, paralyzed, as the men moved to seize her. Evelyn cried out, reaching for Myra's hand, but Jonathan pulled her back, torn between fear and guilt so heavy it nearly crushed him. The men grabbed Mira by the arms. Still, she did not resist. Instead, she looked at Jonathan, not with hatred, not with fear, but with a calm that cut deeper than any accusation. "You knew this day would come," she said, and he had, because once knowledge spreads, it can't be contained. Once minds awaken, they don't go back to sleep. The world he built was collapsing. The world she envisioned was rising. In this moment, this violent, inevitable clash was the breaking point. The storm had finally hit, and there was no turning back. The room fell into a silence, so heavy it felt alive. Tobias Hale lifted the rust-covered lid of the small wooden coffer they had found beneath the rotting church floor. Inside was not gold, not jewels, not relics of saints. It was a map of scars, a piece of stretched skin, human, leather-dry, etched with symbols that pulsed under the lantern light like they were breathing. Isaac staggered back. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." Tobias didn't answer. He was staring, because the marks on the skin were the same patterns carved into the cellar walls where Tobias was born, the same patterns that appeared across his chest whenever his pulse faded, the same patterns the midwife swore were not of this world. But here, etched on ancient skin, was something new, a final symbol, a circle with a split through the middle, a mark he had never seen on his own body. Isaac whispered, "What does it mean?" Tobias swallowed hard. "It means someone else lived long enough to finish what I never could." Outside, the wind shifted. It wasn't natural. It howled like a voice, a warning, a hunger. The lantern flickered. The skin began to tighten, curling, reacting to the air, or to him. And in the hollow quiet, Tobias suddenly realized this wasn't a message from the past. It was a reminder that whatever he was born from never died, and it had marked another before him. Somewhere in the world, maybe alive, maybe waiting, was someone carrying the same curse. But with the final mark completed, Tobias exhaled shakily. "If they finish the pattern," he whispered, "they know more than I ever did." Isaac stepped closer. "So what now?" Tobias gently folded the skin, as if it were sacred scripture or a loaded weapon. "Now," he said, voice low, steady, and terrifyingly calm, "we find the one who survived this before me." The lantern went out. Darkness swallowed the room, but Tobias didn't need light. For the first time, the markings across his chest began to glow. The glow bled across Tobias Hale's skin like molten silver, tracing every line of the ancient symbols carved into him since birth. Isaac stared, frozen, as the cellar around them brightened with a light that wasn't light, more like a memory of fire trapped beneath flesh. "Tobias, your chest, it's reacting to the skin," Isaac whispered. But Tobias didn't hear him, because the glowing lines weren't random. They were moving, rearranging, aligning themselves to match the final symbol on the human hide he held. It was as if his body had waited its entire life for this moment. He saw visions, flashes too fast to understand. A child born in a storm. A woman kneeling over a pulseless newborn. A hand carving's marks in his soft skin. An underground chamber where something ancient stirred. And then, a figure standing in a field of bones with the same symbols glowing across their entire body, but fully connected, complete. The final mark. Isaac grabbed his arm. "Talk to me. What are you seeing?" Tobias's voice came out as a whisper. Someone finished the pattern. Someone like me." Isaac shook his head. "Like you?" "Tobias, nothing is like you." Tobias didn't argue. Instead, he unfolded the dried skin once more and brought it close to his chest. The symbols on the flesh responded instantly, flaring like embers catching air. And then they burned a path across the old church floor. A thin line of glowing ash drew itself toward the back wall, then down into the earth, winding, leading, calling. Isaac stumbled back. "It's pointing somewhere." Tobias nodded slowly. "It's pointing to them." The floorboards thumped beneath their feet, once, twice, like a heartbeat. But not Tobias's. This pulse came from below. Another thump, another heartbeat, growing stronger. The hum of an unseen presence filled the room. Ancient, deliberate, hungry. Isaac whispered, trembling, "We shouldn't follow this. Whatever's down there." Tobias looked at him, eyes glowing the same silver as the marks. "I don't have a choice," he said. "If someone survived what I am, then they know how to end it, or control it." He stepped toward the glowing trail. "And I need that answer before this thing inside me wakes up completely." The cellar door blew open behind them, cold wind slamming through like a warning. But Tobias didn't stop. He stepped onto the glowing line. It responded like a vein carrying blood, brightening, moving, guiding, toward the earth, toward the unknown, toward someone who should have died centuries ago, but didn't. The glowing line led them to a narrow fissure behind the decaying altar, an opening Tobias swore had not been there minutes ago. The air spilling out was cold, older than breath, thick with the scent of stone and something metallic like old blood. Isaac hesitated. "There's no staircase. No ladder. That's a drop straight into hell." Tobias stepped closer. "Hell doesn't call you by name." He knelt, touching the edge. The markings on his chest pulsed brighter, and the crack widened with a slow, grinding groan, as if the earth itself was bending to let him through. "Tobias, this isn't a path. It's a trap," Isaac said, voice shaking. Tobias didn't answer, because something else was happening. The symbols on the dried human skin began glowing too, forming the same pattern now stretching across Tobias's torso. As the lights aligned perfectly, he felt something inside him click, like an ancient lock turning for the first time in centuries. A whisper rode up from the dark below. Not a voice, a memory, half-formed words, half-remembered pain, and a name he didn't recognize. Valerian. Tobias stiffened. Isaac grabbed his arm. "What did you hear?" "Tobias, what did it say?" Tobias looked up, expression hollow with realization. "It didn't speak," he muttered. "It remembered." Isaac blinked, confused. Remembered what? Tobias closed his eyes, listening to the faint echo rising from the darkness. "Me," he said. "It remembered me." Another heartbeat shook the ground, deep and resonant, as though a giant heart lay buried under centuries of soil. The fissure widened. A tunnel of carved stone revealed itself, walls etched with symbols identical to the ones on Tobias's skin. But these carvings were older, ancient, and at the very end of the tunnel, A faint silver glow pulsed like a distant star waiting to be reached. Isaac swallowed hard. Tobias, whatever completed that mark, whatever survived, it's down there, isn't it? Tobias nodded slowly. I think the first one, the original, the one who lived before me. He pointed into the tunnel. Is calling me home. Isaac trembled. Home? Tobias, this isn't home. This is a tomb. Tobias stepped forward, voice calm, resolute. Then it's a tomb that belongs to me. The glow on the tunnel walls brightened as Tobias approached, responding to him like living veins recognizing their blood. Behind him, Isaac whispered, if you go down there, you might not come back. Tobias didn't look back. I've never belonged to the world above, he said softly. Maybe the answers I need were buried with the first heartbeat. He stepped into the tunnel. The darkness swallowed him whole, but the walls lit the path ahead as if they had been waiting centuries for Tobias Hale to return. The tunnel tightened as Tobias descended, the walls breathing with a faint pulse that matched the rhythm in his chest. Isaac followed at a distance, clutching the lantern with white-knuckled terror, its flame trembling as if afraid of what lay ahead. The deeper they went, the colder it became, not a natural cold, but the kind that felt like fingers brushing over bone. At last, the passage opened into a vast chamber carved out of living stone. Isaac froze at the entrance. Tobias stepped forward, and there, in the center of the cavern, lay a stone slab surrounded by ancient markings, glowing with the same silver light flowing under Tobias's skin. On the slab rested a body, not decayed, not rotted, not dead, a man, perfectly preserved, as if time had refused to touch him. His chest was bare. The symbols engraved across his body were complete, interconnected. The full pattern Tobias had only partially inherited at birth. This was the original, the first pulseless child, the one who survived. Tobias approached slowly. Isaac whispered, "Is he alive?" Tobias didn't respond, because as he drew close, the man's chest began to glow, symbols igniting with the same silver fire blazing across Tobias's own body. Then, with a sound like stone cracking, the man's eyes opened. Silver, empty, endless. Tobias staggered back. The man, if he was still a man, sat up, skin stretching like ancient paper awakening after centuries of sleep. When he spoke, his voice sounded like two voices layered over each other, one human, one not. "You've come late," he said, "but you've come." Tobias swallowed hard. You're the one who finished the pattern." The ancient being tilted his head with something like pity. "I completed nothing. The pattern completes itself when one of us survives long enough to learn why we were made." Isaac whispered, shaking, "Made? By who?" The being ignored him. His eyes locked on Tobias. "You feel the hunger, the waking, the heartbeat that isn't yours." Tobias clenched his fists. "I want to control it, before it controls me." A small, haunting smile appeared on the ancient man's face. "That is not control," he murmured. "That is fear." The chamber vibrated, softly at first, then harder, as the symbols on the walls flared like burning constellations. The ancient being leaned forward, inches from Tobias. "You were not born cursed," he whispered. "You were born unfinished." Tobias felt something like fingers of heat crawl through his veins. The being spread his arms. "Complete yourself." The symbols on Tobias's body erupted into blinding silver light, connecting, merging. His flesh is burning and healing at the same time. His pulse, absent since birth, thundered once, twice, and then steadied. For the first time in his life, Tobias Hale had a heartbeat, but it didn't feel human. The ancient being nodded, satisfied. "You're no longer a vessel," he said. "You are a beginning." Isaac stepped back in horror. "Tobias, what are you now?" Tobias opened his eyes. The silver in them was brighter than the cavern walls. "I am what they feared we would become," he said quietly. The chamber began to collapse, stone cracking, symbols burning out, the ancient being dissolving into silver dust as his purpose was fulfilled. Isaac reached out. "Run!" But Tobias didn't move. He watched the dust drift upward, vanishing like smoke. Then he turned toward the tunnel. "We're done running," he said. "Now, the world answers to me." And as the cavern crumbled behind them, Tobias stepped into the returning darkness, not as a child without a pulse, but as something awakened, something finished, something that could no longer be hidden beneath the earth.